point of the paper is we use different methods to get consumer segments. People are different on demographic parameters as well as by thoughts and attitudes. When we use some of the methods, it maximizes the difference on demographic parameters, but among clusters with minimal difference on the attitude on the self or life. So end result is what and how to communicate. Marketeers fail to understand that. On the other hand, that may maximize the difference on attitude among the clusters with very low differences in demographic profiles. So how and where to reach them, we don't understand that. In this paper, the presenter has considered the interrelationship among the demographics and the attitudes using implicative canonical dimensions to form a cluster by mixture model based approach. It's again a Bayesian approach. This method generates clusters which are discriminated by both of the aspects. Debjyoti is a master from Delhi School of Economics. He works with MSc from him in Kolkata. His major responsibilities include strategic market segmentation and the pricing projects. His experience, obviously, in Calcutta it has to be tobacco. Other than that, food and beverage, alcohol, and the personal care as well. He is a fairly regular presenter at various forums, like MRSI 2014, WPP Young Stream 2015, all these places he has presented his paper. His interests is varied: books, music, sports, travel, and photography. And interesting most is that he runs a portal which is called bongacare.com. So over to Debjyoti.
Can people view the presentation?
Hello?
Yes, we can see your screen and the presentation at the moment.
Okay. Right. So, I guess Soumya has already given a pretty extensive background of the paper. So, that is what I was initially going to start with, that when we do segmentation based on attitude, it's like we get distinct segments which are distinct and differentiated in terms of attitude. So if you see, like there are 4 segments here which we have given names like health conscious, happy foodie, a connoisseur, a non-experimental. So if you see, they are quite distinct in terms of the attitudes. But if I was to go to the demographics, you see that everyone has said so. There is no significant difference when it comes to the demographic profile of these clusters. If you see, the non-experimentalist foodie cluster is more or less similar to what the market is. So ultimately, because of this, what happens is that targeting is tough, and as a result, positioning of a brand becomes very difficult for a marketer. So if we have to find a way out for this, what was our basic objective? We had to position the brand and to target the segments, and we had to do this in a way so that the difference in the demographic profile and the attitudes both are marked across the segments. And how we did this was the relationship.
All guests have been muted. All guests have been unmuted.
And so relationships among attitudes and demographics are to be mined out, and then such relationships are to be used for segmentation.
No.
Now the underlying philosophy for this so the underlying philosophy for this would be to have a combination of some intangible descriptors like attitudes and find out what relationship they have with some tangible descriptors like demographics. So if you see in the flow chart, what we first do is derive dimensions that maximally manifest the relationship among the tangible and the intangible, and then use those derived variables for segmentation. And ultimately, when we profile the clusters, we use the original variable. Now, these dimensions, these combinations are what we call as canonical dimensions. Now, what are the canonical dimensions? They are linear combinations of the tangible and the attitudes and demographics. So it's more like a multiple regression where we get a relationship between two sets of variables, and ultimately as an output we get coefficients of the attitudes and we get coefficients of demographics, and these pairing, and ultimately we get correlations between each element. So if you see the correlation between the first attitude statement and the first demographic variable is 0.73. And when we have to consider which dimensions we need to take, it is that we first need to see whether all the correlations are significantly different from zero or not. So if we see a canonical correlation is insignificant at 90% level of significance, we do not consider that dimension. Apart from that, we take an index of the coefficients, and if they are significantly different from the average coefficient, at least 1.5 times greater, then and only then do we consider that canonical dimension for segmentation. Now, when we are dealing with demographics, neither distance nor proximity can be quantified between a male 50 years from Chennai and a 40-year female from New Delhi. So it becomes very difficult for us to do distance-based clustering methods like K-means. But what we used as a clustering technique was latent class clustering, which instead of using linear distances, what it uses is the probabilities. And what we used as inputs for segmentation was a canonical dimension. So ultimately the linear relationship between both the attitudes and the demographics were what we had used for segmentation. So if I were to recap the approach, first we derived the canonical dimensions which were used as clustering variables. This was done to bring out any latent relationship that exists between, let's say, demographics and attitudes. Then we selected which canonical dimensions we need to consider based on certain cutoffs that we took. So one, the canonical correlations need to be significant at 90%, and the index with respect to average needs to be greater than 1.5. And then we use latent class clustering with these inputs to generate the segments. Now, to get a like-to-like comparison whether this method is working or not, what we did was we first tried in segmentation with using only the attitudes as an input, not the canonical dimensions, but just the response to the attitude statements. And what we got was again discrimination in terms of attitudes like I had shown in the first slide, but the demographics in itself, it wasn't discriminated across segments. As a second step, what we did was we included demographics as covariates. So if I include demographics as covariates, what it does is it indirectly affects the segmentation process. Now, in spite of including demographics, what we found was that still there is no marked difference in the demographic profile by segment. And then what we did was we introduced the canonical dimensions as inputs. So if you see, we again ended up with 4 segments which are distinct in terms of their attitudes. So someone who loves food, their attitude is the Chinese preparation, they can pay more to have good food, and someone who is health conscious, their attitudes primarily revolve around they do not prefer junk food, they are not so conscious about brands. And when we see the demographic profile of these people, you see that the demographic difference across these segments have stretched. So, and ultimately what we did, we had to compare all the three types of approaches. So if you see, there were two types of indices. One is the Davies-Boolean index, which gives a number which says if the number is lower, then the cluster solution is better. Another is a Dunn-type index, which is higher the better. So these two index is a measure of how good the cluster solution is, in a way that whether the solutions are homogeneous within and heterogeneous across. So if you see the red marker, which is actually the LCC using canonical dimension, they have come out the best across all three methods and within both the indices. And if I were to talk about the scope of this method, this can be applied to any category, can be applied to any market. Moreover, what can be done is we can combine data of various projects and we can actually do a meta-analysis, and this has generalized applicability, and this research can be reproduced and it can be and in conclusion, what we say is that having this method gives us segments which are both distinct in terms of demographics and gives us marked attitudinal distinction. And in case of segmentation, and finally what it does is it addresses the ultimate objective of segmentation, that it helps design a proper brand portfolio and ultimately helps the marketer to position and target people effectively. Thank you.
Questions, please. Okay, questions for you,
All guests have been muted. All guests have been muted. All guests have been unmuted.
Hello.
We can have the
Is it
questions
okay?
now.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah?
Is it dropped off? Is it there?
Yes?
Would you just elaborate a bit more, I think, on the canonical part? What do you think that when we are taking, let's say, like a toothpaste kind of, when taking the attributes and the demography is not that differentiating, but when we are doing the canonical dimensions, it's become so distinct. So, I mean, what could be the reason? I mean, is it the calculation, or I mean, what is there at the bottom which making the things so distinctive?
See, what happens is that in segmentation, if we only use attitudes as inputs or only use demographics as inputs, what happens is that whatever I'm using as inputs, I get discrimination basis that. But here, when we are deriving canonical dimensions, what it does is it generates a linear combination of both the attitudes and the demographics, and that is why when we use canonical dimensions as inputs to segmentation, it inherently takes care of that relationship. So when the output comes, so the segments themselves are discriminated basis both the demographics and the attitudes, because whatever we have given as inputs are basically a combination of these two.
I don't know how many categories have been checked out. Does it work across categories, or it works in a particular categories like impulsive or the finance kind of stuff?
See, Sanjay, this is Shomo here. The real problem is that when you work with the psychographic segmentation, right, typically it works well with psychographic segmentation. We have seen in many psychographic segmentation is that while you will get a certain level of discrimination, so you know you're able to kind of figure out that these are different consumer typologies, basis psychographic. I mean, we normally don't get to see any targetable markers in the differentiation on targetable markers, be it age, gender, socioeconomic class. And So therefore, the starting point of trying out this method was that can we get segments based on attitudes or based on psychographics, which will also be distinct or differentiated on certain amount of demographic or demographic markers. So now, in order to do that, what we did essentially, and this is why we use canonical correlation. What it tries to do, in very simple terms, it tries to calculate several linear combinations, and it gives a certain coefficient. And you choose that combination where you feel that it is more discriminated, and it gives better correlation. And you use those coefficient scores at an individual level to do the segmentation. So it tries to figure out that possibly a certain group of people think in a particular way because they come from a particular region, or they belong to a homogeneous age group, or their gender is actually determined what they think. Now, it would be difficult for us to kind of figure that out from using any cross-tabular software. So that is why here where the canonical correlation actually helps, because it tries to figure out what the underlying correlations are. So when you use this information to do the segmentation process is again very similar if you use latent class clustering or any other such clustering methodology. It helps you in terms of linking these two factors, and it works much better than just using the demographics as a covariate which a normal LTC or a normal latent class does. Now coming to your question in terms of which categories, now it is, so to be very honest, the way we have tried this out is more of category agnostic approach, which is what people think about themselves, which is more about psychographics, and linking it to demographics. Now, whether it can be extended to finance or other things, we haven't done that for those categories. But I mean, from the philosophy of it, I don't see any reason why it cannot be extended, as long as there are inherent and latent relationships between demographics and other such observable variables and attitudes, what these people think of themselves, and as long as the relationship is there, it should work.
Okay, thanks so much. Agree with you. Any other question? Yes. Thanks, Rajyoti. I think no other questions at this point of time. So over to you, Raja. Hello.
Yeah, Raja?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Raja.
Yeah, sorry, I had muted my phone, and I'm sorry, and I have come back. Just to mention that we had a very lively session today, and the next session happens to be the last session of the MRSI seminar series, and this is going to be scheduled on the 16th April, and I'm very happy to say that Himari will be the chairperson for the next session from Sri Lanka.